It started slowly at first, the change. I didn't notice it right away, but soon enough, it was impossible to ignore. My husband, Mark, wasn't the same. At first, I thought he was just tired. After all, work can be stressful, and we all have those days where we need a little space. But after a few weeks, the distance grew. I could feel it in the way he looked at me, the way he didn't smile like he used to. I could feel it in the silence that grew between us. We used to talk about everything. When we first got married, we couldn't stop talking. Mark would tell me about his day at work, and I would share every little detail about mine. We would laugh together at silly things, and we would sit close on the couch, holding hands. But now it was different. When he came home, he would barely look at me. He didn't ask how my day went. I would ask him how his day was, but his answers were short. He didn't seem interested. One night, I tried to make dinner extra special. I thought maybe he just needed a little attention, so I made his favorite meal, his favorite dessert. I wanted him to feel happy, to remember how much I loved him. But when he came home that evening, he barely looked at the table. He gave me a quick smile, but it wasn't the same smile I remembered. It wasn't warm. It was distant, like he was somewhere else in his mind. He sat down at the table, ate quickly, and then excused himself. I felt a tight knot in my stomach. Why wasn't he paying attention to me? I didn't understand. I tried to talk to him, to ask him if something was wrong. But when I asked, he just said he was tired. He said he had a lot of work to do. I didn't believe him. I didn't know what was going on, but something was happening. I felt it deep in my chest. Something was wrong. The next few days were the same. Mark came home late, sometimes after I was already in bed. He didn't kiss me goodnight like he used to. He didn't talk to me before going to sleep. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, wondering what was happening. Why was he pulling away? I asked myself over and over what I had done wrong. Was it something I said? Was it something I didn't do? I started to feel like I was the problem. Maybe I had changed. Maybe I wasn't as exciting as I used to be. Maybe I wasn't as beautiful as I once was. I looked at myself in the mirror, but I didn't see the woman Mark had fallen in love with. I saw someone else, someone older, someone tired. I blamed myself for everything that was happening. I didn't know how to fix it. Every day, I tried harder to make him see me, to make him care again, but it felt like I was invisible. Mark started spending more time at work, and I couldn't understand why. He would come home late and be too tired to talk. He didn't ask about my day. I missed him. I missed talking to him. I missed laughing with him. I missed the man who used to make me feel special. But he wasn't there anymore. I was alone in our house, even when he was sitting next to me. One afternoon, I decided to do something different. I thought maybe if I made a real effort, if I tried to do something fun together, he would remember how good we were together. I planned a little surprise for him. I went to his favorite restaurant, the one we always went to when we had a good time. I made sure to wear my nicest dress and did my hair, just like I used to. When he came home that evening, I smiled at him and he smiled back. But it wasn't the same smile. It didn't feel like the smile he used to give me. We went to the restaurant and I tried to talk to him. I told him about my day, about the things I was excited about, but he didn't seem interested. He barely looked at me. I asked him how work was, but he gave a short answer. I tried to make him laugh, but it didn't work. We ate in silence. I could feel the coldness growing between us, like a wall that I couldn't break down. After dinner, we went back home, and I felt worse than ever. I had tried everything. I had put so much effort into making this night perfect, and it still didn't work. I didn't know what else to do. I sat on the couch, looking at him, waiting for him to say something. But he didn't. He just turned on the TV like nothing was wrong. I felt small. I felt invisible. I felt like I wasn't even there. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, thinking about everything. I thought about our wedding, about the first time we met, about how happy we were. What had happened? Why was everything falling apart? Was it my fault? Had I changed so much that Mark didn't love me anymore? The next morning, Mark left for work early, just like always. I watched him go, and I felt a deep sadness inside. I wanted to follow him, to ask him what was going on, to demand answers. But I didn't. I stayed home, alone with my thoughts. I spent the day wondering if this was really the end. Was this the moment when everything changed? Was Mark falling out of love with me? I didn't know, but I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. Something was wrong. He was slipping away, and I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know if I could stop it. As the days passed, I became more and more uncertain. Was I imagining it, or was Mark really pulling away from me? I couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't care anymore. I thought about all the little signs, the way he didn't smile at me, the way he didn't talk to me, the way he seemed so distant. I felt so lost. I couldn't fix it, and I didn't know where to turn. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't let things stay like this. But what could I do? I had tried everything. I didn't know what would make him love me again. I felt like I was losing him, and I didn't know how to stop it. All I could do was wait, hoping that things would change, hoping that somehow Mark would see me again. But deep down, I feared that it was too late. Days turned into weeks, and things didn't get any better. I tried everything I could think of to fix the distance between Mark and me. I cooked his favorite meals, I cleaned the house, and I made extra efforts to smile and be positive. But Mark didn't seem to notice. He came home late every night, tired and distracted. He still didn't talk to me. He still didn't smile. The silence between us felt louder than ever. I began to feel like I was living with a stranger. I thought back to the early days of our marriage when we couldn't wait to spend time together. But now, even when he was in the same room with me, it felt like he was far away. I would sit beside him on the couch, but he wouldn't hold my hand. I would try to make him laugh, but nothing seemed to work. It was like he didn't even care anymore. I started to wonder if it was something I was doing. Maybe I wasn't good enough for him. Maybe I wasn't as interesting as I used to be. Maybe I wasn't beautiful enough. I would look at myself in the mirror, searching for the woman he had fallen in love with. But all I saw was someone who had changed, someone who wasn't good enough anymore. I thought about all the things I had tried. I thought about all the ways I had tried to bring us closer, but nothing worked. Every time I reached out to him, I was met with silence. I wanted to talk about it. I wanted to ask him what was going on, to tell him how I felt, but I didn't. I was scared. What if I was making it worse? What if he didn't want to talk to me at all? One evening, I decided to try something different. I had been thinking about it all day, and I decided that I would not wait for him to talk to me. I would start the conversation. I would ask him what was going on, and I would tell him how I felt. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. I waited for Mark to come home that night. I had already prepared dinner, but I wasn't hungry. I couldn't eat. I was too nervous. When he walked in the door, I could see that he was tired. He didn't even look at me. He went straight to the couch and sat down without saying a word. I felt a sharp pain in my chest. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. We were supposed to be a team. We were supposed to support each other. I took a deep breath and walked over to him. I stood in front of him for a moment, not knowing what to say. But then I knew I had to say something. I couldn't wait any longer. I asked him if everything was okay between us. I told him that I felt like we were growing apart. I told him that I missed the way things used to be. I told him that I didn't know what was happening, but I needed to know if he still loved me. Mark didn't answer right away. He just sat there, staring at the floor. I could feel the tension in the air, and I started to panic. Was he going to tell me that he didn't love me anymore? Was he going to say that he didn't care about me? I didn't know if I was ready for that. Finally, he looked up at me, but his eyes didn't look like the eyes I remembered. They were distant, cold. He said that he had been busy with work and had a lot of stress. He said that he didn't know how to talk about it. His words were empty, and they didn't make me feel better. They only made me feel more alone. I asked him if there was someone else. I couldn't help it. The thought had been in my mind for days, and I needed to know. He paused for a moment, and then he said that there wasn't anyone else. He said that it wasn't like that. But his voice was so flat, and his eyes looked so empty that I didn't believe him. If it wasn't another woman, then what was it? I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand the truth, but I didn't. I just stood there, feeling small and helpless. I felt like I had no control over anything. I had tried everything, but it wasn't enough. I didn't know what else to do. Mark didn't say anything more. He just went to bed, and I was left in the living room, alone with my thoughts. I couldn't stop thinking about what he had said. He said there was no one else, but I didn't believe him. The way he looked at me, the way he acted, it didn't feel right. It didn't feel like the Mark I had married. I spent the rest of the night lying in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing with thoughts. What was going on with him? Why was he so distant? Why did he stop loving me? I thought about all the little things that had happened in the past weeks. I thought about how he didn't want to spend time with me anymore. I thought about how he didn't smile at me, how he didn't talk to me like he used to. I thought about the silence between us. It felt like a wall had been built between us, and I didn't know how to break it down. The next day, things were the same. Mark went to work early, and I stayed home, feeling lost. I tried to keep busy, but it was hard. I didn't know how to make things better. I didn't know how to fix my marriage when Mark wasn't even talking to me. I decided that I needed to know the truth. I couldn't keep living like this, wondering what was really happening. I had to find out what Mark was hiding. Maybe if I knew the truth, I could fix it. Maybe if I knew what was going on, I could make things right again. But I didn't know where to start. How could I find the truth? How could I get Mark to open up when he wouldn't even look at me? I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I had to know. The next few days were filled with more silence. Mark went to work early, and I stayed at home, feeling like I was living in a dream, a bad dream. Everything felt wrong, and I didn't know how to fix it. The tension between us was thick, and it felt like it was suffocating me. I missed him. I missed the way things used to be when we were happy and full of love. But now it felt like he was a stranger. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I thought about what Mark had said when I asked him if there was someone else. He said there wasn't, but I didn't believe him. Something inside me told me that he wasn't being honest. The way he looked at me, the way he acted, it all felt off. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I had to know the truth. One afternoon, I decided that I had to find out more. I had been thinking about it for a long time, but now I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I had to see what was really going on. I couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. I waited until Mark left for work. He had been leaving earlier and earlier, and I could tell he was trying to avoid spending time with me. As soon as he was gone, I went to his office. I had never gone through his things before, but now I felt like I had no choice. I needed answers. I needed to know if I was just imagining things or if there was something more going on. I looked around his office, feeling nervous and guilty. It didn't feel right to be going through his things, but I couldn't stop myself. I was desperate. I needed to know the truth. I opened the drawer of his desk, hoping to find something that would give me a clue. At first, I didn't find anything important, just papers and pens, nothing out of the ordinary. But then I saw it, a small piece of paper sticking out from behind some folders. I pulled it out and saw that it was a message from someone at his work. The name on the paper was a woman's name. I recognized her. Her name was Rachel, and she was someone who worked in his department. The message was short, but it made my heart drop. It wasn't just a work message, it was personal. She had written something like, "I can't wait to see you later." There were no words of love, but the tone was clear. It was friendly, but there was something else in it, something that didn't feel right. It was the kind of message you send when you have feelings for someone. I felt sick to my stomach. I couldn't believe it. I felt like everything was falling apart. My hands were shaking as I held the paper. My heart was pounding in my chest. Was this really happening? Was Mark having an affair? The thought of it was too much to bear. I didn't want to believe it, but the message was right in front of me. There was no denying it. I put the paper back where I found it, feeling like I had just uncovered something I wasn't ready to know. I didn't know what to do next. Part of me wanted to confront Mark right away. I wanted to ask him what was going on, to demand the truth. But another part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't seen anything. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew that I wasn't. I had seen enough to know that something was wrong. That evening, Mark came home as usual, tired and distant. He didn't even notice that I was different. I didn't know how to act. I wanted to yell at him, to ask him about the message, but I couldn't. I didn't have the strength. I was too scared. What if he told me that it was true? What if he told me that he didn't love me anymore? I wasn't ready to hear that. Instead, I just sat there quietly, pretending that everything was fine. I made dinner just like I always did. We ate in silence, and he didn't seem to notice that I wasn't talking. I didn't know how to talk to him anymore. I didn't know what to say. That night, as we lay in bed, I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. The message from Rachel kept playing in my mind. I kept wondering what it meant. Was Mark seeing her? Was he in love with her? Was I losing him? I turned to look at him, but he was already asleep, his back turned to me. I felt the tears starting to come, but I didn't let them fall. I didn't want to cry. I didn't want to show him how much I was hurting. But inside, I felt like my world was breaking apart. The next day, I couldn't focus on anything. I couldn't stop thinking about the message. I kept replaying it in my mind. Every time I thought about it, I felt more and more sick to my stomach. I didn't know how to handle it. What was I supposed to do now? How could I fix this? I knew that I couldn't keep living in this kind of pain, wondering if my husband was seeing someone else. I had to know the truth. I had to find out if this was real or if I was just imagining things. I made up my mind. I wasn't going to wait anymore. I was going to confront Mark. I was going to ask him about Rachel, about the message. I didn't care how scared I was. I needed to know the truth, and I couldn't live in the dark any longer. But even as I made the decision, I felt a wave of fear wash over me. What if Mark didn't love me anymore? What if he told me that he was seeing someone else? What if this was the end of everything? I didn't know what the answer would be, but I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I had to find out the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to uncover something that would change everything. I had made up my mind the night before. I had to talk to Mark. I had to ask him about Rachel. I couldn't live in fear anymore. I couldn't keep wondering what was going on in his life. I spent the day trying to prepare myself for the conversation. My stomach was in knots, and I felt nervous, but I knew I couldn't avoid it. I had to face the truth. It was better to know than to keep guessing. When Mark came home that evening, he looked tired again. His eyes were heavy, and he walked through the door without saying much. I could see that he was still in his own world, wrapped up in whatever was troubling him. I tried not to let my feelings show on my face. I didn't want him to know how much I was hurting, but inside, I felt like my heart was breaking. I waited until we sat down to dinner. The silence was unbearable. I could hear the sound of my heart beating in my ears, and I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I took a deep breath and decided to ask him, "Mark, can we talk?" I said. It was a small sentence, but the weight of it felt like it was too much to carry. He looked at me, confused. He didn't know what was coming. I wasn't sure if he knew what I had already found, but I had to do this. I had to get the answers I needed. I told him that I had seen the message from Rachel. I told him that it was a personal message and that it didn't seem like just a work message. I told him that it made me feel like something was wrong, and I needed to know if he was seeing her. Mark didn't say anything right away. He just stared at me for a long time. I could see his face turn pale, and his lips trembled slightly. I didn't know what was going through his mind, but I could tell he wasn't happy that I had found out. I felt a rush of emotions. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to demand answers. But another part of me wanted to run away and forget everything. I wanted to protect myself from the truth, but I knew I couldn't. I had to face it. Finally, Mark spoke. He said he wasn't seeing Rachel, but there was something between them. He didn't go into detail, but I could tell that it was more than just a friendship. I didn't want to hear more, but I had to. He told me that he had been feeling lonely. He said that he felt like he wasn't important to me anymore. He said that he had been looking for someone who would listen to him, someone who understood him. He didn't say it clearly, but I could hear the pain in his voice. It was like he was telling me that he had already made up his mind. I felt like the ground was slipping from under me. I had no idea that things had gotten this bad. I didn't know that Mark felt this way. I thought I was doing everything right. I thought I was being a good wife, but I was wrong. I had missed something. I had missed the signs. Mark didn't say anything else. He stood up and walked out of the room, leaving me alone at the table. My mind was racing. I felt like I had just been hit by a truck. The words he had said kept repeating in my head. I didn't know what to think or feel. My heart hurt so much that it felt like it was breaking. I sat at the table for what felt like hours, but it was only a few minutes. I was lost in my thoughts. I didn't know what to do next. I didn't know if I should fight for my marriage or if I should let him go. Everything felt so uncertain. The next few days were hard. Mark and I barely spoke to each other. I couldn't stop thinking about what he had said. It was clear now that he wasn't happy. He wasn't in love with me anymore, and I didn't know if I could fix it. I had tried so hard, but it seemed like nothing I did mattered. I spent a lot of time in the house alone thinking. I couldn't help but blame myself. What had I done wrong? I kept asking myself that question, but there were no answers. I wondered if there was something I could have done differently. Maybe if I had paid more attention to Mark's needs, things wouldn't have turned out this way. But it was too late for that now. I thought about Rachel and the message she had sent. It didn't feel like just a friendly message. It felt like something more. I started to wonder if Mark had already made up his mind about her. Maybe he had already fallen for her. I didn't know if I was strong enough to face that. One evening, Mark came home later than usual. He didn't seem in the mood to talk, and neither was I. The silence between us had become unbearable. I wanted to say something, but I didn't know what to say. I was afraid of making things worse. The days continued like this, with the silence growing thicker and thicker. We were both in the same house, but it felt like we were in different worlds. I didn't know how much longer I could live like this. Every day, I woke up with the same heavy feeling in my chest. I was afraid of what the future would hold. Would Mark leave me? Would he choose Rachel over me? I didn't want to live in fear anymore. I had to make a decision. I had to figure out what was best for me. I couldn't keep waiting for Mark to change. I had to find my own way forward, even if it meant letting go of the man I had loved for so many years. But I wasn't ready to make that choice yet. I was still holding on to the hope that things would get better. I just didn't know how. I spent the next few days in a fog. The silence between Mark and I was unbearable. We didn't talk much, and when we did, it felt forced. I could feel the distance between us growing. It was like we were strangers, living in the same house but never really seeing each other. I was exhausted from thinking about everything, but I couldn't stop. My mind kept going back to that message from Rachel, to the way Mark looked when he told me there was something between them. I couldn't stop asking myself if I had lost him for good. I wasn't sure how to fix things. I had tried, I had given everything, but now it felt like nothing was enough. I wondered if Mark even wanted to fix things. Was he still interested in me? Or was it too late? I didn't know the answer, and the uncertainty was slowly eating me up inside. I went about my days, doing the normal things, cooking, cleaning, taking care of the house. But it all felt meaningless. I did everything as if it didn't matter. I felt like I was just going through the motions. I had lost myself somewhere along the way, and I didn't know how to find her again. One evening, as I sat in the living room, I noticed Mark's jacket on the chair. He had been out all day, and I hadn't seen him since he left for work that morning. I felt an urge to do something. I wasn't sure what it was, but it felt like I needed to take control of my life again. I couldn't just sit and wait for him to change. I needed to know what I was going to do. I thought about what had happened, about everything I had learned. Mark had been distant for a while, but I hadn't wanted to see it. I hadn't wanted to believe that things were getting worse. But now, I had no choice but to face it. I had to make a decision. That night after dinner, I decided to do something I hadn't done before. I took a deep breath and walked into Mark's office. The office where I had found the message from Rachel. I wasn't sure why I went there, but something inside me told me I had to. I needed to know what was really going on in his life. I looked around the room, trying to find anything that might give me more answers. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find, but I couldn't stop myself. I went through his papers again, moving things around. There were the usual bills and work reports, but nothing that stood out. My hands were shaking, and I was starting to feel sick. What was I looking for? Was I hoping to find something that would prove I was wrong? That Mark wasn't seeing Rachel? That we could still fix things? But then I saw something. It was a letter. It was from Rachel. It was short, but it made my heart drop. The letter wasn't about work at all. It was a confession. Rachel had written to Mark, telling him that she missed him. She said she couldn't wait to see him again. There was no doubt in my mind now. Mark was involved with her. He had feelings for her, and I wasn't sure if there was any way to bring him back to me. I felt sick to my stomach as I put the letter back. It was clear now. He wasn't just distracted. He was in love with someone else. I felt like my world was falling apart, but there was nothing I could do to stop it. I had spent so much time hoping that things would get better, but now it felt like all my hope had been crushed. I didn't know what to do next. Part of me wanted to confront Mark right away, but another part of me wanted to run. I didn't know if I could handle hearing him tell me that he was in love with someone else. But I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. I had to face him. The next day, Mark came home late again. He didn't say much, and I could tell he was tired. He walked into the kitchen and I followed him. I didn't know what to say, but I couldn't keep the pain inside anymore. I had to talk to him. I had to know if everything was over between us. I took a deep breath and asked him about the letter. I asked him if he was in love with Rachel. His face went pale when I mentioned her name. He didn't say anything at first, but I could see it in his eyes. He didn't deny it. He didn't tell me I was wrong. And that was enough. The truth was clear now. Mark had feelings for her. He didn't want to be with me anymore. I felt like I was losing everything. The tears came, and I couldn't stop them. I didn't know what to do. How had things gotten so bad? I had tried so hard to hold on to our relationship, but now it felt like everything was slipping through my fingers. I wasn't sure how much more I could take. Mark didn't say much. He apologized, but it wasn't enough. He said he didn't want to hurt me, but I could see the distance in his eyes. I didn't know if he was sorry for what he had done or if he was sorry because he was getting caught. I couldn't tell anymore. All I knew was that I couldn't keep living like this. That night, I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about everything. I had to make a decision. I couldn't keep living in this painful, uncertain space. I had to figure out what was best for me. I knew it was time to let go. I knew I couldn't change Mark's feelings, and I couldn't keep holding on to a marriage that was falling apart. But I didn't know how to start over. How could I let go of someone I had loved for so long? How could I move on from a life I had built with him? I didn't know the answer, but I knew I had to find it. I wasn't ready to make that decision yet, but I knew I had to start thinking about what my life would look like without Mark. I had to let go of the dream of a perfect marriage and start living for myself. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only choice I had left. The next few days were quiet. Mark and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was about the basics, what needed to be done around the house, or who would pick up the groceries. It was like we were living in two different worlds. I felt the weight of everything we hadn't said hanging between us, but I knew that nothing could be fixed now. My heart was heavy, and I was tired. I couldn't keep living in this space of uncertainty. I had to make a choice. I knew the time had come for me to think about my future. Mark had already made his choice. He had feelings for Rachel, and no matter how much I wished things were different, I couldn't change that. I couldn't keep holding on to something that wasn't there anymore. It wasn't easy. Letting go of someone you've loved for so long is never simple. But I had to admit to myself that the person I had loved was no longer the same. Mark was a different man now, and I was a different woman. We had changed, and not in a way that could bring us back together. It hurt, but I had to accept it. I started to focus more on myself. It felt strange at first, as if I was unsure how to take care of myself without thinking about Mark first. But I realized I had to do this for me. I needed to rediscover who I was outside of my marriage. I couldn't let my life be defined by the man I had once loved. I needed to find my own happiness again, no matter how hard it seemed. The first step was to give myself permission to grieve. I allowed myself to cry, to feel the pain. I wasn't going to ignore it anymore. For so long, I had tried to be strong, thinking that if I just worked hard enough, everything would be okay. But now I understood that sometimes things don't work out no matter how hard you try. That was the reality I had to face. As the days passed, I started to feel a little stronger. It wasn't quick, but it was something. I took walks alone, enjoyed the quiet, and started to remember the things I loved to do before my life was so focused on Mark. It wasn't about forgetting him, it was about finding peace again. Slowly, I began to feel like I was getting my life back. Mark continued to stay distant, not that I expected anything else. He had made it clear that he was more interested in Rachel than in working on our marriage. It was a sad realization, but one I had already come to terms with. I had to let go of the idea of a perfect relationship. I had to let go of the person I thought Mark was and start accepting the person he had become. One day, I sat in the living room, looking out the window. I had spent so much time thinking about what had gone wrong, blaming myself for everything. But now I saw that I wasn't the only one responsible. Mark had his own choices to make. I wasn't perfect, but I had done my best. I had given my heart to him, and even though it had hurt, I knew I would be okay. That was the moment I realized that I didn't need Mark to be happy. I could be happy on my own. I didn't need someone to complete me. I was whole by myself. It was an important realization. I had spent so many years believing that my happiness depended on him, but now I understood that my happiness had always been in my own hands. The next few weeks were a time of change. Mark started spending more time away from home, and I found myself becoming more comfortable in the quiet. I could feel the weight of our past together starting to lift piece by piece. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I missed him. I missed the man I had once loved, but I also knew that I couldn't go back. We couldn't go back to the way things were. One evening, I decided it was time to talk to Mark again. I didn't want to hold on to any anger or resentment. I wanted to move forward, but I also wanted closure. I needed to say goodbye to the version of our relationship that no longer existed. When I found him in the living room, sitting quietly, I felt nervous. I wasn't sure what would happen, but I knew I had to speak my truth. I told him that I understood he had feelings for Rachel, and I couldn't keep living in a marriage where we were both so unhappy. I told him that I was letting go, that it was time for both of us to move on. Mark didn't say much. He looked sad, but I could tell that he wasn't surprised. He had known this moment was coming, just as I had. He apologized again, but his apology felt different this time. It wasn't about fixing things. It was about acknowledging that things couldn't be fixed. As I walked away from that conversation, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't easy, but I knew it was the right decision. Letting go of someone you love is never easy, but sometimes it's the only way to move forward. Over the next few months, I focused on myself. I spent time with friends, rediscovered hobbies I had forgotten, and started to feel like myself again. I learned to be alone without feeling lonely. I learned to be happy without depending on someone else. It was a journey, but it was mine. Eventually, I moved out of the house we had shared. It felt like the final step in letting go, but it also felt like a new beginning. I didn't know what the future would hold, but I knew I was strong enough to face it. I was no longer afraid of being on my own. I had learned that I could create my own happiness. Mark and I still saw each other occasionally, but it was different now. There was no anger, no hurt. We had both moved on, and I could finally accept that. The past was behind me, and the future was full of possibilities. I was ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that I could handle it. Looking back, I knew that everything had happened for a reason. I had been forced to face my fears, to let go of what wasn't working, and to rebuild my life. It had been hard, but it had also been liberating. I had learned that sometimes you have to let go of the things you love in order to find the strength to love yourself again.